Hey, folks, you're listening to the Jobs Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Hendricks, and today we have Brian with us. Brian made a career with the DEA. He had, I think it was over 23 years, and now he's gone on to greener pastures, so to speak. So, Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tim. Happy to be here.
So, Brian, let's start off with a little bit of your origin story, where you were born, early upbringing, and we'll just kind of walk through your education and career and go from there.
Sure. So I was born into a military family. My father was a career Army, and I was born in Germany on a military base there in Stuttgart, Germany. We moved back to the States when I was young, and that's where he retired in Virginia, Northern Virginia, Fort Belvoir, for your military listeners. I went to school in Virginia, high school in Virginia, but then I decided I needed I needed a change of pace. And after high school graduation, I moved to Missouri, where I went to college in Joplin at Missouri Southern State University. I got a few degrees there, and then I stayed in the area and went to graduate school in Pittsburgh, Kansas. And then I became a police officer, and then from there, DEA, and I guess we'll save all that for the other questions.
What were your degrees in that you got?
So at Missouri Southern, I got a 2-year degree in law enforcement and a 4-year degree in criminal justice administration. And then I made a decision to stay in the area. I was still trying to figure out, how I was going to achieve my goals, and I worked on my master's degree, which was human resources of all things, but with an emphasis in training, which would play a role later in my life.
Did you have law enforcement on your radar pretty early on? Or, I mean, you said your dad was in the military. Did he have military police? Was that his role, or did he do something completely different in the military?
No, he was actually completely different. I didn't realize I had anyone in my family with prior law enforcement until later on in life. When we were doing some genealogy, I found out that my grandfather, for a very short period, was a police officer, but I didn't know that going in. No, I had an interest in law enforcement, actually drug enforcement in high school, my high school years. I was seeing what drugs were doing in my community and the people around me, and I just didn't like it. I didn't like the way that they were turning out and what it was doing to people. And I made a decision that I wanted to be part of some type of solution to, basically get rid of this stuff. And but I didn't know what that looked like. I had that vision, or I had that dream, but I still didn't know how to achieve it. I was still figuring that out.
When you got into law enforcement early on, I'm assuming you were a beat cop for a while, or do they even call it that, patrol officer?
Yeah.
How long did you do that before, or did you have any, well, first of all, how long did you do that? And did you dive into any drug-related special teams or anything along those lines when you were in law enforcement before the DEA?
Yeah, I joined the Joplin Police Department in Joplin, Missouri, in the 1990s for 5 years. It was a great experience. I loved the department, the community. It was just a really special time and learned so much. Was a patrol officer, but I did have an opportunity to be on a street crimes unit, and that really, the flame was there, but it really ignited just being able to work, more drug related crime. And, I knew I wanted to go into the DEA, but I was still trying to make all that work. But I was enjoying, the street crimes unit and just patrol in general. And like I said, it was a great experience. It really was, end up being a stepping stone. I don't say that in a bad way. I just, it really built the foundation for when I would leave and join the DEA.
It was kind of a stop in your journey.
Absolutely. It was an important stop too. I was, quite frankly, I was pretty naive, and there were a lot of things I had to learn, and being able to learn them as a police officer, really helped. And I think I'd like to believe it made me a better criminal investigator.
The shift when you went from a local law enforcement agency to a national DEA agency, what was that process like? Was it pretty easy for you because you were just in your lane and you were ready to go, or was it kind of a shock to you, the changes in every aspect?
Looking back, it wasn't too bad. I mean, I was nervous about the process. What if I fail? What if things don't work out the way that I had anticipated them to work out? But the process wasn't too bad. I mean, it just like I said, that foundation that I had developed as a police officer at Joplin really, really helped. So a lot of things that we were learning in the academy, I think I had a I had to step up, right? I had some foundation there, so I think that really helped. But looking back, it wasn't too bad. I think it was more of just getting in my own head and and you know making myself too nervous and afraid to fail when I knew I had when I knew I could do it.
I'm assuming they go over your life with a fine tooth comb and polygraphs and the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, it's a long process. I tell everyone who's interested in federal law enforcement to don't put your life on hold. I mean, it is a very long. I was actually a record hire. I mean, when I say that, it was about 10 months,
Wow.
and of course, 10 months is not a short time, but it is in DEA speak. I had classmates that were in the process for 2, 3 years before they got hired. So I always tell young people who are interested in this career to don't put your life on hold if there's other opportunities, take them, because this is something that can take a while. But yeah, the process is long. I mean, you're from interviews to random drug screenings to you got to see a doctor and be medically cleared. Then you can take your physical test, psychological tests, polygraph tests. It's just a long process. And I actually traveled quite a bit. It wasn't all in one location. I was in St. Louis, I was in Topeka, I was in Tulsa, I was in Oklahoma City. I mean, I had to travel quite a bit to put all the pieces of this hiring puzzle together.
The steps that you go through, do you find that most folks come from they already have law enforcement experience? Is that the natural progression, or do you have a lot of folks that get a degree in an applicable field and they go right to the DEA?
Yeah, it was a mix. I think when
Okay.
I got hired back in the '90s, we certainly had a lot more law enforcement and military backgrounds at DEA, and I'd still argue that that's probably the majority of the hires, but it's certainly not a prerequisite, and worked with a lot of amazing investigators who didn't have prior law enforcement or military backgrounds. A lot of folks have degrees, and I mean, I worked with engineers, I worked with teachers, I worked with people who had just a variety of backgrounds, and they were successful.
What's the academy like? Is it a lot of physical stuff, or is it more cerebral, or is it a good mix? And how long does it typically last?
It's a good mix. So our academy, when I was there, was about 17 weeks. I think
Okay.
they're probably 18 to 20 weeks now. The academy's in Quantico, Virginia, so it's on the Marine Corps base. So the Marine Corps base, as far as federal law enforcement, is known for the FBI Academy being there. But in 1999, we built our own facility. But prior to that, we were co-housed with the FBI, and like I said, 16, 17 week program when I went through. A lot of physical training, a lot of firearms training, and a lot of academic training. I'd say between those three disciplines, we were getting a lot of hours. Like I said, tons. I mean, we probably shot 5,000 to 6,000 rounds on the range. A lot of physical fitness, a lot of running. Our physical fitness instructor, he loved to run. In fact, we got lost on a run one time, and we estimated that we ran about a marathon, about 25, 26 miles in total.
Good
That was
grief.
fun because we end up missing some classes afterwards, and I think some people got in trouble, but because it wasn't planned. But yeah, we ran quite a bit, and then like I said, the academics. I mean, everything's a lot of classroom, law, drug identification, and just simple investigations. I mean, just a lot of academics, and then the fourth part I would put in there was what we call practical application, where we would take what we would learn and we would train it in a safe environment. So we would have role players who would, pose as drug dealers, and we would meet with them, or we'd surveil them, or we would arrest them. We would everything we were learning in the classroom, we would actually do hands on. in a controlled, safe environment. So very professional. It was a great experience. Living in the dorms. Just being around folks who share that common interest you know to to go after the biggest, baddest drug dealers and put them in jail. So a lot of fun.
When you're done with the academy, does everybody come out with the same? Is it kind of like the medical field where, okay, you graduated from medical school, now you start your residency where you're going to start applying some of the things that you've learned with some oversight and figuring out where your area of specialization will show up? Or how does that kind of play out when you're done and you're actually doing the job?
Well, if you're an 1811, if you're a criminal investigator, then you graduate as a special agent. So everyone's on the same playing field. When you graduate, you go to your assigned office, which you know prior to your graduation, and then you go through additional training. And we would call that like field training, just the FT process. So much like a police officer goes through a FTO process, we call it an FTA process, field training agent process. So you're assigned a senior agent who, you shadow, and he or she grades you for, I forget how many weeks it is, but there's an evaluation process every day, every shift, if you will. And then once you meet that criteria, then you're on your own. I mean, hopefully you're going to be working with others in a team, uh, yeah, when you leave the academy, I mean, it's a level playing field. Now, if you have an interest in doing something more specialized, there are a few opportunities out there. I think Air Wing's one, or if you're a pilot, or if you want to be a pilot, then, after a few years of being a special agent, a criminal investigator, actually working the investigations, well, then you can start specializing in some of these things. But for the most part, our workforce is just criminal investigation. It's just, identifying these organizations and putting the investigations together, and working with the U.S. attorney's offices to prosecute them.
What's that? What's your career like on a day to day? I mean, are you a Monday through Friday, or are you working all hours of the day and the night and the weekend, just depending on the case that you're dealing with?
Yeah, it's you'd like to say it's a Monday through Friday, but it's
Yeah,
really not. I mean, there's so many times when you come into work and then you don't go home till 2 or 3 in the morning. If you even go home, there's many of all nighters, and it really, the work dictates your schedule. I mean, it really does. On the lucky days, you go in at a normal time and you go home at a normal time, but sometimes you're not so lucky. So it's a lot of independence, a lot of freedom. You might have, depending on your level of supervision needed. If you're brand new, obviously you're probably going to have a little more guidance and supervision. But as you start to learn the job, they're going to definitely give you a lot more freedom. To initiate these investigations and then work them. And then sometimes that can take a few months, and sometimes that can take a few years. So every day is a little different. And that's one thing I really appreciated about the job, was that every day was, you really dictated kind of what you did, and it wasn't the same routine every single day. And then not only do you have your investigations, but you also support other investigations. I mean, the teams I worked on, typically 8, 10, 12 people, they all have cases as well, and they need support as well. So that might be surveillance, that might be, an undercover operation. And I mean, there's all types of avenues that the investigations can go down.
the drugs back in the 80s and 90s when I was younger, it was just always cocaine, crack, meth was, I think it was around, but it didn't seem to get the attention that it does, or wasn't so common nowadays. Maybe I was just living in a bubble. But and then of course you had marijuana. Are there other things out there that you dealt with on a regular basis that maybe the general public isn't aware of was a bigger problem than folks thought?
No, I mean, I saw the evolution of pills, especially the counterfeit pills. And I don't think people really, pills don't have that dirty look. If
Right.
you don't, if you sit in a bathtub at night with a beer, it's kind of weird. But if you sit in a bathtub at night with a glass of wine, then it's,
Classy.
it's classy, right? And pills have that same, if I had heroin, you look at me one way, but if I'm If I have counterfeit perks or Adderall or something, you look at me a different way. And so I saw a lot of that. Most of the drugs we saw are the same that are in the press all the time: methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, marijuana. But I certainly saw a lot of pills early on in my career, and how they really took over, and again the perception that they were safer or somewhat different than the other drugs, which is really silly, but we certainly saw that. And then I saw the evolution of opioids into fentanyl and how that's taken over. And I think about my career. I mean, almost 30 years in law enforcement, I never saw a drug more impactful than fentanyl, and it's still killing people at alarming rates. One's too many, but we're losing 200 to 300 people a day to drugs now in this country, and the majority of those folks are losing their lives because of fentanyl.
Is the issue with fentanyl just its potency in and of itself, or is it what's different about that besides its potency compared to the other ones?
That's the big one. It's the
Okay.
potency. It's the fact that only 2 milligrams. It has to get into your system, but once it gets into your system, it only takes a little bit. And we've never had a drug like that in our drug supply. I mean, to give you an idea, 30 milligrams of heroin is considered a lethal dose, and only 2 milligrams of fentanyl is considered a lethal dose. So that's a significant difference between the two. In fact, a lot of times when I speak, especially to young people, I'll put approximately 2 milligrams of sugar into a little vial, and then I'll do the same thing with another vial with approximately 30 milligrams, because I want people to physically see the difference between the two drugs. So I think that's a big thing, is that you have just a very powerful drug. It only takes a little bit to kill the average human being, and how that's found its way into the majority of our drug supply.
A lot of these drugs you hear about meth and whatnot where you take it for a while and then you start needing to take more and more and more to achieve the same high that you got when you first were introduced to it. Is fentanyl, does that operate the same, or is it the low dose is what will do it, for years?
No, it does operate the same. It's the
Okay.
dependence, and ultimately the substance use disorder, the addiction, and not only does it operate the same, I would actually argue that it operates uh, significantly more powerful than the other drugs. The brain and fentanyl, unfortunately, get along too well, and it just overpowers the brain. It really does, and all drugs do that, but fentanyl certainly does it at a higher level, and that's what makes it even more dangerous, and that's what causes respiratory depression ultimately, um, and that's what's killing people.
Do folks a lot of times not realize that whatever they're consuming has fentanyl in it? Is it used to cut other drugs?
Yeah, and that's a big reason why we saw a spike in deaths. I mean, when I was a police officer, we had 3,000 people a year dying from drugs, and now we have 100,000 plus people a year, and the majority of those folks, like I said, are going to die from one drug, fentanyl. And I would argue that the vast majority of those folks had no idea that they were even consuming fentanyl. I mean, fentanyl found it was put into our drug supply as a cut into heroin, and then from there it went into the pills. Now I mean, if you have a pill, there's a counterfeit. I mean, absolutely counterfeit. It doesn't have to be an opioid, by the way. It can be any type of pill, prescription pill that traffickers will counterfeit, and then they'll use meth, they'll use fentanyl, they'll use other garbage to put it in the drug. And they like fentanyl because it's highly addictive. So, and it's very, very inexpensive.
Mm.
So they put that drug in there, and it gets people hooked if it doesn't kill them, and it keeps them coming back as a customer, and that's ultimately what they want. But then from there, it found its way into cocaine, it found its way into methamphetamine, and I mean, it's just like I said, most of our drug supply is now contaminated with fentanyl, and most people have zero clue. They're looking for you know some oxy, they're looking for Xanax bars, they're looking for cocaine, they're looking for another drug, and unbeknownst to them, they're getting fentanyl, and that's what's really driving the deaths up.
I say it was common knowledge. I think most folks, if you say where does cocaine come from, they're going to say Central America. It seemed, Colombia and all that seemed to be where the majority of that stuff came from. Is that still the case? And then when you're specifically talking about fentanyl, where is that? Where's the hotbeds of production for that particular drug?
So the supply chain starts in China.
Okay.
China is the number one source for the precursor chemicals to make fentanyl. So their biggest customers are the drug cartels in Mexico, specifically the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel. They operate out of Mexico, and they bring these precursor chemicals into Mexico for production, mass production, and then they smuggle the drugs into the U.S. for consumption. That's how most of the fentanyl comes into the U.S. That, like I said, China to Mexico, Mexico right into the U.S. There are some other players involved. India definitely sells a lot of precursor chemicals. There's a couple of European countries as well, but China by far is number one. That's why there's been so much attention on not just the trade war, but how we can reduce the flow of fentanyl into the United States by you know by negotiating with China and holding them accountable for what they're doing.
When you're operating as a DEA agent, the I'm assuming you get a project, a case, and you just dive into that. What's the typical approach? Is it kind of, I'm going to gather data first and we're going to figure out who we're dealing with, what we're dealing with, where they're located, what they're marketing, what they're pushing, what they're, and then you start finding weak points in their operation? Is it kind of a death by a thousand paper cuts approach to where you finally can get to the top?
Yeah, I mean that's a good way of putting it. Absolutely. I mean, the first thing I'm going to do is I want to get as much information as I can. Was the information obtained from an informant? If so, then that person and myself are going to be sitting down for probably several hours, and I want to drain all the information I can. And then once I get all the information and draw some type of picture in my mind of what we're looking at, and I want to deconflict it all. I want to know everything I can. If I have a name, if I have a house, if I have a vehicle, if I have if I have a ship, it doesn't matter. Any information I can, I'm gonna deconflict it. I'm gonna see what information's out there. There's other investigators, there's other law enforcement or other folks that are interested in the same people. That we can make those connections and build a bigger picture of the organization and what they're doing, because no one operates alone. At some point, they have to acquire the drugs and we want to take that as high as we can, and it doesn't matter if it's in Mexico or if it's in France. I mean, we want to, we want to work the investigation as high as possible and make the most impact we can. So yeah, we want to definitely, a lot of paper cuts, like you said.
One of the things that I've just assumed, and correct me if I'm wrong, law enforcement, it's frustrating when you have a certain set of rules and things that guide, limits put on what you can do, when you can do it, how you can operate. But you're dealing with entities that do not have any rules, and they can do or will do whatever it takes to achieve their objective. Is that a constant wall that you butt up against when you're in law enforcement, specifically the DEA, when you're going after these entities that have no rules?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that you definitely think about, and it's a conversation at some point in your career you're going to have. But we have laws, we have morals, we have values. At the end of the day, I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror and sleep at night, and that's something that these organizations that we work, don't have to worry about. They're driven by money, and they don't care who they kill or who they hurt. And we're driven by something greater than that. And we need to hold these people accountable. And so, yeah, we have these conversations, but I don't. I think it goes away because you're doing the right thing. Is it frustrating at times? Sure, and then you see you see that they're easy money, and you see their lifestyles, and that can drive you crazy as well. But that they're is it fair that they're living life like that, and so many people aren't, and then they're struggling. But But you live on our morals and our principles that we're doing the right thing, and that we're making our community safer, and having a positive impact. So you just don't let things like that cloud your judgment, or affect your work.
Is it a numbers game for these organizations where we're going to smuggle, let's just use random numbers, 20 different shipments with the understanding that we're probably going to lose 25% or whatever, a certain amount will be caught. But if we keep doing this, the majority of our product will get from point A to point B.
Absolutely a numbers game. You look at the
Okay.
border right now. I mean, everyone's talking about how there's not many migrants coming over the border, yet we're still seeing a significant seizures and our drug numbers. In fact, they've increased over the last month. And a big reason is because most drugs come into the United States through the port of entries. The point of entries, the same entry points that you and I would take, traveling to and from Mexico. So now our resources can be diverted to those areas, and we can concentrate on drugs and other, contraband. But they're going to play a numbers game. We can't search every vehicle or every vessel coming into the U.S. as much as I'd like to say we can, or as much as
Mhm.
I'd love to see that happen. It just doesn't. So if I have I don't know, let's say I have 100 pounds of methamphetamine, maybe I separate that into 10 pound loads, and as long as I get a few over, then ultimately I'm in the black. I'm not in the red, and that's the goal of the game. And they're very good. I mean, as much as I hate saying that, they're very sophisticated, and they're highly adaptive. So it's a numbers game, and unfortunately they're beating us. There's an individual that we've worked with who was responsible for a lot of the investigation against El Chapo with the Sinaloa cartel, and he cooperated with the government, and now he actually works with law enforcement and trains law enforcement. And he always says that they only lost about 5% of the loads coming to Chicago. The majority of the drugs they were smuggling into the U.S. all the way up into Chicago, he made it. 95% of the loads made it. Isn't that incredible when you think about that?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, that's
I
a
had no
problem.
idea. I was thinking 50, 60% it would be a good day.
Yeah, when I worked on the border down with the DEA, we used to have a lot of meetings with the Border Patrol, and they're wonderful people, and I still have a lot of friends that work for them. But it was always interesting to me when they would have these meetings, and they would estimate that they were getting the majority of drugs coming across the border. And the first time I heard that, I thought they were, punking me. I thought, I'm like, what drugs are you using? Because I would love to be able to say that we're getting 80, 90, 100% of the drugs coming across the border, or coming across, or being smuggled into the U.S. That is, and the reality of it is that's just not the case. I mean, you can just look at the seizures and the consumption in the U.S. I mean, every single day there's a drug seizure somewhere, right? And people that are struggling with substance use, they're not having any problems obtaining their drugs.
The cartels, is it is it safe to say that when you cut the head off of a snake, another head pops up? I mean, they just don't seem to want to die or go away. I'm assuming they have lineage plans where if something happens to the top guy, we have one or two other people that'll take their place.
Yeah, and one of the reasons they're so successful is just the way they operate. Most cartels operate on a horizontal organizational structure. It's almost like a franchise model.
Oh,
So, and what that means is there's major decision making throughout the organization. So, take McDonald's for instance. McDonald's, I believe, is still in San Francisco, or not uh, San Diego, California. The franchise or franchisee. If you and I were going to open a McDonald's in town here, that, and we wanted to hire a bunch of people, that's a major decision, right? To hire people, we don't call the corporate headquarters in San Diego and say, hey, can we make this decision? We just do it. Same thing if we were going to fire people. Again, major decisions that are happening. We make those decisions. Could you imagine if we couldn't? You're like, how slow would business move, right? And that's how most organizations work. Most most organizations have this organizational structure where you have someone at the top of your food chain, your organizational chart that's making major decisions. I don't mean everyday decisions, but I mean the major ones. Like, if I worked for the Springfield uh, uh, Police Department, I don't wake up, and I'm a patrolman. I don't wake up one day and say I'm going to change the color of the uniform. Like that's a major decision that would probably impact, or probably the chief and maybe even the city leaders would be involved. So back to the cartel, you have these major decisions that are made throughout the organization. So if you and I, all we do is load vehicles with drugs, we don't ask for permission from the highest levels. We just do it. Maybe you and I, all we're responsible for is killing people, and someone's messed up. Maybe they've cooperated, they've lost a load, something's happened. We kill them, and that's a major thing to do. But we don't ask for permission. So you have all these folks who are just making these huge decisions throughout the organization. And what that does is it compartmentalizes them. It puts them in little silos. So now let's say you and I get arrested. How much damage are we really doing to the rest of the organization? We might know some folks here and there and in the cell that we're working with, but how much damage does that do to the rest of the organization? I'm not saying we shouldn't work them, but that makes them really, it insulates a lot of their command from the various employees, if you will. It's a weird thing to say, employees, when you talk about cartels.
Yeah.
But if you and I are now the leaders of let's say the Sinaloa cartel or the CJNG, and somebody who just loads vehicles up every day gets arrested or killed or something, the chances of him having any ability to cooperate or hurt you and I, pretty limited, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so that's one of the reasons why we have to identify who controls these cells, who has the command of the different areas of the cartel, whether it's the manufacturing, whether it's the distribution, whether it's the money laundering, and then go after those folks and constantly go after them and disrupt as much as often as we can. So it's very difficult. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm not saying it doesn't make a difference, but it's not as easy as just putting someone in jail and thinking that it's all going to go away.
The drugs that you dealt with, were there, you had mentioned early in our conversation that when you were younger, you saw, I think you said you were in high school and you saw the effect that drugs had on people around you and how negatively it impacted their life and the family members and friends around them. As you got through your career, is that something that you kind of held on to as your motivation to, even though it sometimes feels like we just talked about everything is siloed and the goal of shutting them down almost seems out of reach perpetually, but I'm going to disrupt this as much as I can and make their life as miserable and as difficult as I can. Is that what kind of kept you going every day when you were in the DEA?
Yeah, it is, and especially towards the end of my career, as I was reflecting more on what we were doing and if we were making a difference. I certainly was thinking about all the families impacted and the communities impacted, and just all the my interaction and personal stories, and that really drove me, even post retirement, to still be involved. I now run a non-profit organization called Only 2MG, and our entire mission is to talk about not only illicit fentanyl but other emerging public health threats, and that is part of my motivation. That is part of what keeps me going, is the devastation it has. I'm one of those people that got into law enforcement to make a difference, to help our communities. Did I want to drive fast cars and jump out of helicopters? Well, certainly. I mean, who doesn't? That's
Yeah.
fun stuff. But my purpose, my mission, what gets me up in the morning and what motivates me, is making our community safer and seeing, healthy, happy people who thrive in our communities.
Where do you think the biggest impact can be had for preventing addiction or abuse? Is it middle school, high school, or is it just all over the map to where it's more of someone's personality or exposure to a certain thing that ultimately plays a part in whether they go down that dark road or not?
Well, we have to reduce the demand. I mean, at the end of the day, this is a really is a simple, business or economics problem. We
Supply
have
and demand.
supply and demand. It really is, and put this in perspective. The United States accounts for about a little over 4% of the world's population. Yet we consume the majority of drugs. That's a problem, in as much as, I can demonize, pharma or the China or the cartels or just drug traffickers in general. At the end of the day, I mean, they only exist because, supply and demand, right? I mean, they only exist because we consume the most drugs. And, I know when El Chapo got arrested, one of the questions he was asked is, will you ever stop selling drugs? And he says, when there's no more demand in the United States, we'll stop. And it's powerful, right? And that's what we have to do is we have to reduce the demand. So I think we do that through our children. It's we're doing our children a disservice. We don't give them any type of training. We just send them out, and I'm tired of it. It's one of the reasons why I do what I do post retirement. And talk to people, especially young people, is we got to give them information. It's not just saying, "Hey, don't do drugs." But let's give them factual information. Let's give them information about why they shouldn't be using drugs. So when they're in these difficult situations in life, they have the information and hopefully make good choices. Most people who struggle with substance use disorder, who struggle with addiction, start before they're 18 years old. And we got to get to our kids younger and younger, and we got to give them this information. And unfortunately, parents just aren't doing this. Everyone I know, and myself included, who works in this sector, talking to parents is difficult. It's not that a lot of them don't want to hear it, but they just don't show up. They just, less than 1% of parents actually give a damn. And it's usually when it's impacted them or someone close to them that they actually show up. We need people to actually be proactive and get this information and be force multipliers, talk to their family and talk to anyone else. And until we start doing that every single day and really making a difference with our young people, then we're going to continue to have this demand. And I think, and I think it goes deeper than that as well. I think, why do a lot of young people use drugs? We know, there are some, boredom or peer pressure, but we know a
Yeah.
lot of them, the vast majority of them are escaping some type of trauma or some type of abuse, whether it be physical, sexual, mental, there's something going on in their lives. They're using drugs as a coping mechanism. And there is safer ways to do that, safer, healthier ways to do that. And I think we need to focus on those things. We don't have those conversations. I mean, look at mental health in this country. I mean, we have more resources available now for things like, let's say, suicide, for instance. Yet we have more people kill themselves every year. The numbers
Mhm.
continue to increase, although we're addressing it, more and more than we ever did. Why? It drives me nuts because the answers are there. We just refuse to do it as a nation.
The comment that you made a minute ago about the parents not showing up, or a very small percentage showing up. I'm a parent myself, and one of the things that my dad taught me pretty early on was you're you're capable of just about anything. You're capable of committing horrible crimes. Just because you're my son and I think you're a good kid doesn't mean that you don't have the ability to do bad things and make bad decisions. Do you think a lot of parents sometimes think, well, not my child. My child wouldn't do that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You hear that all the time,
Hmm.
especially when it comes to, like fentanyl poisonings and things like that. We hear stuff like, well, my child only smokes marijuana or only drinks alcohol. There's no way that he or she would ever use fentanyl or heroin or methamphetamine or other drugs. I mean, yeah, we hear that quite a bit. Or there's just the denial that, my child's good. There's no way they'd ever use drugs. We hear that quite a bit. I hear I call it the head in the sand, where they just out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah.
If we don't talk about drugs, then they won't use them. And I laugh because, if they've been on social media, then people are talking about drugs. If they watch movies or listen to music, people are talking about drugs. So they're going to have the conversation. It's going to be entered. It's going to get in their brain one way or another. Why not give them good information,
Yeah.
and accurate information, and just, tell them, just talk to them, not at them. But believing that somehow they're going to use drugs because you talk about it is just absolutely silly. It's not grounded in evidence. It's not fact based, and it just, like I said, it's just silly.
What have you found to be the most effective way to get your information across to younger people? I'll just say anybody, high school age down to middle school or even elementary school, because I remember, when I was growing up in the 80s, it was the dare stuff was all the rage, and Nancy Reagan was, just say no, and all that kind of stuff. It kind of gets to a point where you're all shuffled into a high school gymnasium, and there's a speaker comes up and tells you a story, and it kind of goes in one ear and out the other. Are
Yeah.
there new approaches that you have found to be more impactful, or that get through, I've heard this before, or I'm not going to do drugs, so I don't need to pay attention?
Yeah, I think there are. And I think that's talking with them and not at them. I think it's just giving them the information. One of the things I tell young people when I talk is, hey, I'm not here to say, just say no, to the Nancy Reagan, just say no approach. And of course, when I say that, a lot of the administrators or teachers look up and think, oh no, who do we bring in here? Obviously I want them to say no, but my goal is to empower them with information,
Hmm.
and I really do believe that that knowledge is power, but it has to go beyond that. So I tell them, hey, knowledge is power only when you execute these things, right? If I know drugs are dangerous and I still make the decision to use them, then I didn't properly execute my knowledge, right? So I think that's the approach. Is just talk to them, just give them the information. Hey, these are the pressures that you have right now, and a lot of you are going to turn to drugs or alcohol, and this is why we believe you shouldn't. This is what it does. This is what it does to the brain, which is developing, until into your mid 20s, and this is what it does to the folks around you. I mean, this has such a impact in all aspects of your life, and just give them that information. Just let them consume that information, and I think kids are a lot smarter, and they can make these connections a lot more than sometimes we give them credit for.
Hmm.
But when they see what the drugs can do, and they see how the impact can be on them, and I call my presentation "Shattering Dreams," and the things that they think about, their goals or dreams, and they can see how they just get destroyed. Then they're armed with making their own decisions, and it's a lot easier to convince people to do things when they have the information than it is to just tell them. Saying no to drugs and them not understanding why we say that, gets them curious. It gets them, sometimes a little defiant, but just give them the information. And then when they're in those situations, they can say, okay, I know that this is going to do X, Y, and Z. Probably not a smart idea. So they come to that conclusion themselves. So they get that buy-in, they get that ownership. And I think that's important. And I think and I think it works, and I've had a lot of young people come up to me, and I know people in this space, who are constantly in schools, and they've had a lot of success, with young people who stay away from drugs, or they find help, um, for the things that they're struggling with, so they don't turn to drugs and alcohol as a coping mechanism.
Do you think that people underestimate the word addiction? I think sometimes is thrown around so much.
Yeah,
It's just like love. Everybody says, "Oh, I love him. I love her." You've known each other 3 weeks. You don't even know what love is. But I have seen in my career a number of snapshots of people that are suffering from addiction. And, you know, you run a medical call to a gas station bathroom at 2 o'clock in the morning because someone's passed out at the base of the toilet. And they'll wake up and they'll say, "I'm fine." And you look at them and you think, it's 2 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday. You're in a gas station bathroom with your face on the tile at the base of a filthy toilet. You are not okay. But I don't think addiction, it sneaks up on you, doesn't it? And it's just all of a sudden it has your hooks in you. And people like to think, well, I can quit. I'll be fine. And then the next thing you know, you're 2 years into it and you're thinking, what happened?
Yeah, and that was something that I struggled with personally for a long time understanding. It really was. And I meet a lot of folks who every single day who just don't understand what addiction is. And that's one of the reasons why I like to talk about it is to have a little understanding of what's happening in the brain and the body. Uh, that'll create a little bit of empathy and understanding. And I think that will make you more effective when you're dealing with these situations. Uh, you know, I start basic. I talk about dopamine. When you use a substance, you get a dopamine release. And dopamine is a natural substance that our body produces. We get it from a lot of things. We get it from sex. We get it from video games. But drugs amplify that. That's the high you feel, right? That's the euphoric feeling you feel. And then you start chasing it because you like that feeling, right? We all like that feel good sensation that we get when we do things.
Mm-hmm.
So when drugs amplify that, you're like, oh, these people all lie to me. This stuff feels good. So you constantly use the drug more and more and more until you build a tolerance. So that means you need more of the drug to get that same effect. And people will eventually tell you that they never will ever feel like they did the first couple times they used that drug.
Mm.
And ultimately that's going to drive, a dependence or an addiction to that substance. And that's what people don't understand is I can't tell you how many folks, parents who just say, I don't understand why my son or daughter just doesn't stop. And people will tell you when they're struggling with addiction, substance use disorder, stopping is not easy. They call it dope sickness, the withdrawals. And they'll tell you, look, I'm not trying to destroy relationships with my family or friends. I'm not trying to lose jobs. I'm not trying to, not pay my mortgage or my rent. I'm not trying to go to jail or be found on that toilet seat at 2 a.m. or at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. But the pain and the addiction is real for a lot of these people that, it becomes almost their way of life, right? I mean, just to put jeans on in the morning, they have to have that drug. And again, I think that's what creates that stigma and that misunderstanding of what addiction is, because there's people out there, let's face it, there are people out there who could use drugs on a Sunday night and Monday morning they're off to work and you'd never know, right? And then there's people that use drugs and the first or second time their life just starts to spiral down because, the brain just reacts differently. And then when we have the way we treat these folks, that plays a huge role into it as well, because a lot of these folks actually do want treatment. They do want help, but the embarrassment, the shame that comes with it. I mean, every single study I've read talks about the number of people who really, truly want to reach out for help, but they're just afraid to. They don't want to be shunned by their friends and family and by society in general. And I think, again, the more we understand about this, the more empathy and compassion. And that doesn't mean we agree with their decisions or think there shouldn't be consequences for the things they do. I absolutely think there needs to be consequences for the things we do in life. But I also think that we shouldn't abandon these people, that we should, support these people and figure out how we can get them help and how we can help them, get to recovery and long, prosperous lives. But the stigma is real. I mean, that's something that, look at the words we use. I mean, we call them addicts, we call them junkies. If someone in your family had cancer and all your neighbors found out, what would happen immediately? I mean, they would cook you dinner.
Yeah.
They would send you cards. I mean, they would rally behind you as they should, as good neighbors should. But then just say that same family says, oh, and our son is also struggling from addiction, from drug addiction.
Yeah.
Everyone's gonna, they're gonna turn their lights off when you come home. They're gonna avoid you like somehow you have the plague. It's interesting how we treat people where's the support when that stuff happens? Where's the empathy? Where's the dinners and rallying behind people in those times. It's very telling of a person how they treat people um, when they're struggling with those things. And the reality is, a lot of our families out there are struggling with this, and especially now with fentanyl, it's impacting so many people. Um, yeah, I think the more you understand addiction, it again doesn't mean you have to agree with any of this stuff, because I always get that all the time. Well, you think we think we should legalize drugs and think this should be okay? No, I don't. I don't think any of those things. But I do
Hmm.
think that these are human beings, and I think we should give a damn about their health and safety. And I think we can do more to to help them.
It is a you use the example of cancer and then addiction. They're both diseases. One
Yeah,
is just one is viewed as an acceptable. It's okay for me to be sympathetic because this person is a victim. They have cancer. They didn't do anything, and they got it, and now I want to help them. Versus this other person, they're looked at oftentimes with derision because it's like, well, they did this to themselves. And yeah, they took the drug the first time, but I don't think people understand the power that those chemicals can have over the human body. And then you have someone that, if I don't get that substance, I'm going to go insane. And that is a really powerful effect on the mind and the body. But we do view it as polar opposites. One is self inflicted, the other is an innocent victim.
polar opposites, and we call it a moral failing. We
Yeah.
don't call it a disease, and that's part of the problem, and that's what creates more of that stigma and that division amongst opinions. You're absolutely right. It's and that's why I encourage people to learn more about what addiction is and what it does to the brain. I mean, I talked about dopamine earlier. I read a study that said, sex gives you about a one-time increase in dopamine. Heroin, the first time you use it, gives you about a 10-time increase in dopamine.
Good
So
grief.
you're talking about a significant difference in how a drug impacts your brain than other activities that typically make us happy, give us that dopamine release. Um, so yeah, you nailed it on the head. I mean, it's so powerful on what it does to the brain and how it impacts people. And I can't tell you, and I'm sure you as well, the number of people who are struggling with this, who will tell you that, hey, I'm not, I don't want to die. I don't want to live like this, but
Hmm.
I don't know what else to do. This drug is telling me I need to have it every couple hours of my life. If I don't have it, I go through these very, very painful withdrawals. Like I said, we call it being dope sick. And that's a powerful thing. It's not, that's when someone is suffering from that, that's not, why can't they just stop?
Yeah.
It's not that easy. And that's why the treatment side, there's two things we got to do, right? It's medicated assisted treatment. One is we got to wean them off the actual drug that they're on. And number two is we got to figure out why, what's the cognitive behavior? Why did they turn to drugs? Because it's one thing to get you off the drugs, but if we don't solve the reason you're taking them, then all you're going to do is going to go back to the same, or to another substance, and the cycle will repeat itself.
Is the, and this may be different for every person, but what do you see folks say when you ask what is more difficult, the physical withdrawals or the mental withdrawals? Where do you find the most difficult um, pullback? Or are they kind of one and the same, really?
They're kind of one and the same. I mean, maybe a little bit more of the physical stuff. Um, I, I don't know. I'd say more people talk about some of the physical pain and withdrawals they experience, but certainly the mental as well. I think it's just a accumulation of the, when someone says that the pain of a drug withdrawal is more difficult than losing a relationship with, let's say, mom, dad, spouse, significant other,
Wow.
boss, police officer, firefighter, or first responder, jail, death, you know, that's pretty powerful. Like, we
Yeah.
got to listen to that, and we got to figure out why. What happened in the brain where someone says, there's a video I show in one of my presentations. It's a young lady who's struggling from substance use disorder, and she says, I know the risks. I know that I might die, but the pain associated with stopping is too great. And that's powerful. That's not, I did a national program a couple weeks ago. It was actually Bill O'Reilly, and he kept on saying this was just a choice. This is just a choice. These people just want to get high. That's all they want. They just want to get high. And I couldn't disagree more. This isn't about getting high. Yeah, the first couple times, sure, and do I like the decision they made to use drugs? No, of course I don't.
Hmm.
But when these people are struggling with addiction, this isn't about getting high. This is the furthest from getting high. The people want to get high, but this is more about not being sick anymore.
It's the worst of all the worlds because you're chasing a high that you're never going to get again. You're addicted, so you can't quit. And so I can see why you just absolutely spiral.
Yeah, and it's just yes, and the more we understand that, and again, I hate to have to put this disclaimer on there. Again, it doesn't mean we agree with it. It doesn't mean that we have to accept it as a normal behavior. But the more we understand it, the more we're going to have the more effective we're going to be communicating and dealing with it and helping people. And when I wear the badge and gun, um, people they don't see that side of me, right? They just see the badge and gun, so they think, well, they're going to be held accountable, they're going to go to jail. Um, but when they learn that, hey, I want to learn more about them and what they're struggling with, and how can we get them help, real help, then that empathy, that understanding, man, let me tell you that's when relationships start to form, right? And that's when people are more willing to accept help because they see your motive. They understand that you're trying to understand what they're dealing with, and they're more eager to want to work with you, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I just thought of a question that, if I'm putting you on the spot, you're free to decline to answer. But
Okay.
I'm not asking you to speak for the DEA as an agency. But in your time there, do you find that most of your coworkers and the folks that were in that agency, did they have that understanding as far as, yes, this is a disease. There also are consequences for trafficking and things of that nature, smuggling, but there's also a human element here that, a multi-pronged approach to stopping the addiction so the supply and demand issue is solved. Did you see a lot of your folks or that had shared your same mentality, or were most of them enforcement only? These are criminals and addiction is not real, or it's not that big of a deal, and we're just going after, the gun and badge approach.
Yeah, interesting. I certainly saw a lot more that were more empathetic and understanding of what was happening, but I don't think it really drove their decisions. DEA is part of the enforcement approach, and I do
Right.
think that's an important part of this very complex puzzle. To go after these biggest, baddest organizations and hold them accountable for selling these poisons. Um, that's tough.
It's also not in your job description. I mean, you can put them in touch with folks that maybe could help them, but
Yeah.
like you said, you're the enforcement arm.
Yeah, and there's more DEA was doing, but as a whole,
Hmm.
DEA really hasn't done a lot there. It's more just the enforcement part, and again, like you said, that's their job, right? That they weren't put there to do the harm reduction or anything else. I definitely see it more from the individuals. I mean, I didn't wear a lot of this on my sleeve when I was at DEA. I was really trying to understand a lot of it myself. I mean, I struggled with understanding addiction for years and years. There's several things in law enforcement that I struggled to understand. I think, when I was a brand new police officer, for instance, I had no idea what domestic violence, was. As far as, I mean, I knew what it was, but as far as how powerful it was mentally. I mean, I can remember, early on, I go to these calls, and typically, not always, but typically it was the female that was the victim. And a lot of times, we would go to arrest the aggressor, the husband or boyfriend, the male subject in the house. And while we're taking him to the patrol car, taking him away, it's like, don't arrest him, don't arrest him. And then when he turns around, they'll wink at you and say, thank you. They'll with their lips, you know what I mean? They'll to quietly say thank you because that's what they really wanted, but they didn't want the aggressor to know that.
Right.
And I'm thinking, what is this, the Twilight Zone? Like, what is happening here? Like,
Yeah.
you call the police, but yet we come and you're not cooperative, or you tell us that you didn't call us and you don't want your husband arrested, even though you do. Anyway, there was a lot going on, and as a young police officer, I was just like, what the hell am I experiencing here? And thankfully, we had some older police officers who realized that, and they got us into some training, and we started to understand this whole cycle, this whole domestic violence cycle, and that made us more empathetic, and it made us just more understanding, and it made us more effective in communicating and how we dealt with these situations. And again, that's just one example, but I think there was a lot of things like that, and when it came to addiction, I mean, it was early on, it was like, you made your bed, now you have to sleep in it. And then
Yeah.
I really wanted to understand, well, I don't think they really wanted to do these things. I don't think this person wanted to be homeless or wanted to, to break into this car because they needed money to, for their next fix, and again, I'm not agreeing with the things they do, but the more I started to dive into it and understand it, the more, again, I'm more effective I think it made me, or at least it definitely gave me a better understanding and how I could deal with folks who are struggling with this.
I recognize that in our conversation, you have said a number of times that you qualify your statement with, I don't agree with what they're doing. And I understand why you're doing that, because I do the same thing. You don't want to, sometimes you just can't have a conversation with someone to where I don't agree with what they're doing. And I need you to understand that. I'm not wanting to just legalize drugs, because there's plenty of examples of states and countries doing that. And it just always really doesn't go well, as far as what I know anyway. So you can say, I can have empathy for someone and want to help them, but also want to enforce the laws. You can have both viewpoints. Two things can be true at the same time.
You're absolutely right. And I probably actually say that too much. And I think the reason I say it is because there are
People get
people that will make
defensive.
that assumption. Yeah. And they'll
Yeah.
get defensive, and they'll
Right.
say, and I've had people early on when I was talking about addiction in my fentanyl presentations, I had a friend of mine say, what are you, a tree hugger? You think we should legalize drugs? So then I thought to myself, well, I guess I need to qualify this. So, I probably say it too much. I probably do qualify it too much because I'm afraid that I'm going to isolate people's opinions if they decide that I'm on a certain hill, and that's not the hill
Yeah.
they want to be on, and but ultimately, I mean, I also know that I can't, if they've made that decision, I can't change it, and it's not going to
Sure.
impact my work, and it's not going to impact my ability to sleep at night. I believe that I'm morally right, and that by helping people, we make a difference in this world, and I'm going to try to. That's a good point. I'm going to try to say that less.
Well, no, it
I'm not
certainly
critical.
wasn't a criticism at
No,
all.
no, no, no. I
I
didn't take it
understand.
that way, but yeah,
I understand exactly why you do it. The fault is on the people that instantly close their mind off to hearing
yeah,
an expert such as yourself speak on a topic that you know about, and that's just ignorance and arrogance on their part if they're not even going to hear you out. So,
yeah,
um, but so let's jump back into your career, the DEA stuff. You've amassed 23, I think, was years, a
yeah,
little
yeah,
over 23 years. What
yeah. 20,
was what was the catalyst that made you say, I think my time with the DEA has come to an end and I'm going to move on to the next chapter in my life?
yeah, that was tough. Love DEA. Still involved with DEA. I'm actually on the board of directors for the Agents Association.
Hmm.
So I do a lot with them nationally, still engaged with a lot of folks, very aware of a lot of things happening at DEA. Um, my last assignment was in Springfield, Missouri, where I was the resident agent in charge. So I was in charge of the DEA office and the 26 counties in Southwest Missouri that we're responsible for. Great people around me, great relationships. It was a very difficult decision to leave, and I had more years that I was capable of working. But I had the itch to do something different, and I really wanted to be involved in more training and the teaching and the speaking aspect. That's something that I've been interested throughout my career. I was always the guy, even as a police officer, where I don't know, let's say the Rotary Club needed a speaker and no one wanted to do it. Hey Townsend, are you interested? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And I was the guy that would, the red ribbon weeks in the schools. I've always had an interest in talking to people, especially young people. And then, my master's degree, human resources with an emphasis in training, that, so I had an idea of the power of training and how to put curriculum together. And then every opportunity throughout my career, in DEA, I would raise my hand and I would say, yeah, I can go talk to that school. I can go talk to that organization. And then when I went to Quantico, so 4 years of my 23-year time with DEA was spent at Quantico at our training academy, where I was in charge of most in-service training. And then I actually got to start DEA's leadership and development training unit. And that really, I mean, again, the fire was there, but that really just got it going. So when I came back out in the field, I was happy to come out in the field and be involved in enforcement operations again. But then I knew what I wanted to do. It was set. I always had the interest in going into training, but then now it was just a matter of figuring it all out, the logistics of it all. And so I left. I left in 2022, and I started my own training and consulting business, which I still do. And then that led me to work with the Mid-States Organized Crime Information Center, which I still work with them. And then that led me to start my own nonprofit organization, and which I still do as well. So, yeah, it was a difficult decision, but no regrets. I love DEA, and I miss the people I work with, and I miss the work that we did. But I wanted to write a new chapter in my book. I wanted to, young enough to do something different, and I thought that I could have an impact in a different way, and that's what I hope I'm doing. I hope I'm impacting our world in a positive yet different way than I did at DEA.
We talked earlier in our conversation about the cartels and getting their product to their customer as kind of a numbers game. The
Mm-hmm.
more that they send, the more gets through. Do you, I guess you could view your approach to speaking with people also as a numbers game. The more times you speak with an audience, the more times you're going to get through to some people, and it just spreads and spreads and spreads.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it, and I think that's because the reality of it, there are people out there who are going to roll their eyes or make a decision that's contrary to what I'm speaking about. Especially young people. But I do know that there are young people that are making good decisions because of the information that I've given them, and that's another motivating factor of what I do. And I've had a lot of them talk to me afterwards. They come up to you and they hug you, and they tell you some really deep personal stuff that they're struggling with, and your heart just goes out to them. But that's when you feel though that you're making a difference. Gosh, so many great examples. I had a police officer in one of my classes for first responders who, she decided to start carrying naloxone, Narcan, and that week, because their department had a choice. And that week, she saved someone's life from a heroin overdose. That same week, with the exact naloxone that I gave her. That and that's a life that has potential now to get into recovery and do amazing things, right? Um, I had an officer who, we talked about the exposure myth. I had an officer who was afraid to be around fentanyl, and after we spoke, he got aggressive and started working narcotics again. And he's taken just tons and tons of fentanyl off our streets. And then there's just the kids who, I mean, I did some work at Missouri State, and the first time I spoke there it was probably a month or two later. I was at unrelated event like a month or two later, and one of the students walked up to me. I had no idea who he was. He was just one of the few hundred that were in the room, and said, "Hey, the words I spoke really gave him a lot to think about, and he'd been dabbling with drugs and was making better decisions now, and that's powerful, right? I mean, that's just emotional stuff that gets me going. But but back to your question, it's a numbers thing. Do I think, am I naive to think that 100% of those kids in that room are not going to use drugs or stop using drugs? No, of course not. But for the ones where it does sink through and makes that difference, then man, that's a great thing.
I can see it too. Just it's a snowball effect. You help one, then they may help somebody who helps somebody, and it just your work just keeps kind of growing as you do it. And that has to be satisfying to know that you are making a difference.
Very rewarding, and that's what the times when when I get up in the morning and I think, Brian, am I doing the right thing? And do I keep going? I put a lot of my personal money into this, and I don't say that to brag. I just, that's not easy to do. I don't have a money tree I can just shake.
Yeah.
But I believe in what I'm doing, and there's this line that make the world or be the change you want to see in this world. Um, and I just believe in that. I really do. And to me, it's not just about, it's not words, it's actions. I can say anything I want to say. We all can, right? But it's what we do that really matters in this life. And I'm not foolish enough or naive enough to think I'm going to be remembered when I leave this world. But I'm hoping that for the few folks who do remember me, it's for the positive change I made in their life.
Mm-hmm. Let's get back to a little bit of the nuts and bolts stuff of the DEA. I want to get your just some basic answers. What did you like most about your job, and what did you dislike most about your job over your time at the DEA?
Yeah, I loved working with the different people. I mean, one of the things that's cool about DEA is we're not bound by city limits or state limits. I mean, I got to travel quite a bit. I mean, I think about some of the cool investigations that I was a part of. I mean, I worked an ecstasy case once where it was coming in from France into Miami, and then from Miami it was being shipped all across the country. And I got to travel to a lot of cool places, and not only that, but a lot of investigations, but just working with amazing people, so many dedicated professionals who had the same, principles, who had the same heart, that understood what we were doing, and is making it their life's mission to eradicate this crap out of our communities. Just the people, to people.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of the frustrations was just, early on, why weren't people being held accountable? Why weren't people being prosecuted? Why did people get lesser sentence than they deserved? And then you deal with those things. You realize that those things are out of your control, and that, me being upset by a decision that a prosecutor or a judge or someone else made, that, I can't, why am I going to let that dictate how much sleep I get? My job is to do the best I can, and go home safe. And that's what I try to do every day.
Were there a lot of technological changes in your career? I can see starting, in the early 2000s and then ending in 23, the AI was starting to show up a few years ago. You've got drones, you've got,
Yeah.
everything is on a computer now, and our phones and stuff. And it lost, I would assume, a lot of the old school, or maybe they still use that because it's more effective than the technology stuff. There's no tracking.
It's interesting. It was fun seeing the how technology evolved. Certainly, the thing about investigations is the foundation's the same. If you're my target, my goal is to put you in jail, right, or to build a case that can hold you accountable for what you did. And one of the things that we're really good at DEA is exploiting communications. So, maybe when I started, it was beepers, and still we had payphones and
You're
things like
talking my
that.
language.
Yeah, and landlines.
Yeah.
And now it's encrypted apps. It's Telegram, it's WhatsApp. It's things like that. So the technology has changed, but the investigations really haven't. Right? I mean, maybe back then I used your beeper, but now I hit you up on on WhatsApp or something. I mean, we're still going to try to exploit that communication. It might be a little bit more difficult now because of the encryption and because of the the laws and things like that. But at the end of the day, I mean, the goal's the same. So yeah, I mean, I definitely saw evolution there, which is, and I continue to see that, right? I mean, look at law enforcement now; it's
Yeah.
amazing. I mean, before long, you're going to have a 911 call. You're going to have a drone above that person's house, automatically sending, and this is already happening in some cities. Sending video feedback to the officers that are responding, or any first responder that's responding. So you have a visual of what's happening, and then if there's a vehicle that leaves, be able to capture the tag. If there's people that leave, maybe we can do facial rec or something like that. I mean, it's going to continue to get just bigger and bigger and more effective, and the bad guys, unfortunately, like we talked about earlier, they don't have to worry about the law and morals.
Yeah.
So they're going to figure out ways to exploit these technologies, and we're going to have to figure out ways to stay within the law and also exploit these technologies and successfully investigate these crimes. But certainly saw an increase in AI. Oh my goodness, I had doing a project right now. I'm working with a guy. We're trying to do some AI training, and he blew my mind away with all the different software and platforms. And oh my goodness, that's a whole different discussion there.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm hoping to get an AI expert on the show at some point because it's percolating into every area. Every occupation is going to have AI in the next 5 years. It'll be a big part of our jobs. But
Yeah,
what
scary.
types of what types of soft skills did you see the successful agents in the DEA? Was there a common set of skills that if you have these two or three soft skills, that usually lends itself to success?
Well, I'd say communication by far,
Mm,
100% communication. Not just talking, but I mean, just listening, being an active listener, your nonverbal, your written communication. I mean, just you gotta be good at your communication skills. You gotta clearly and effectively convey information. Be an active listener. We far too often when we hear people talk, we're thinking about that response in our brain, and I would encourage people to yeah, you want to know what to say, but what is this person actually asking you? What are they actually saying? Where are they coming from? Actively listening to them. Um, Time management, I think that's another big one. That's something that sometimes I struggle with, just organizing and prioritizing, whether it's a task, whether it's a deadline. um, Problem solving, we talk about this on a lot of our training as well, just not just problem solving, but what comes with problem solving, creative thinking, decision making, being creative. Uh, but if you had me narrow that list down to one, I would by far say communication. I think that is the most important soft skill that all of us can. If we can get better at it, it'll definitely make us more efficient.
Do you find most of your coworkers were typically extroverted, introverted, or was it just a mix of all kinds of personalities?
It's a mix, and it's so funny because in law enforcement, they're going to tell you that they're all extroverted. They're all A personalities. You hear that all the time in law
Yeah.
enforcement. And I worked at the training academy for 4 years. And not only did we I was in charge of most in-service training. And like I said, I get to start the leadership and training development unit. And not all of our training was internal, even though, in-service is. We did a lot of external training and brought a lot of our state and local partners in. And some of the training we were doing, especially specifically in our leadership classes, was personal assessments. So I'm sure you've heard of like Myers Briggs or DISC or Insights. I mean, we used several of them. In fact, I'm DISC certified. And in emotional intelligence, I mean, we did a lot of these types of personality tests. And we would always ask people at the beginning, "Hey, who here? What percentage of this room is going to be like that A personality, the one we always hear about, the extrovert?" And it's almost always, oh, probably 90%, 95%. If you're going to be in law enforcement, that's your personality and blah, blah, blah. And without fail, because we'd always have them take the test before they actually got to training, and then we'd give them the results when they were there. it was never 80 or 90%. It was even seldomly over 51%. It was, and then I started doing this stuff with just law enforcement because I thought, was this DEA? Is there a difference between DEA? And like I said, we had a lot of law enforcement mixed into our training. But then I was doing law enforcement only training, the same thing. I could give them the DISC or Myers Briggs, and a ton of them would not be that extroverted personality. And what I think what they fail to understand is it doesn't mean you can't be an extrovert. Now I'm not naturally an extrovert, but if you put me in that bucket, or if you put me in a situation, I'm going to reach into that bucket and find a way to express that personality. You know what I mean? Especially in a law enforcement setting or a first responder setting, where you might be the guy that's quiet and timid or sits back, but in certain situations, you're going to need to, you know, uh, be a little more assertive. And I think we confuse that with, well, everyone's extroverted, and that's just not the case. So
The word timidity that you used, you can still be a confident go-getter, but
absolutely,
not be noisy about it. And sometimes I think
yeah.
extroverted and type A is equated with a lot of noise and boisterous activity and over the top. I'm alpha and all that other stuff. But I've met plenty of guys, and I'm sure you have too, that are very, very sure of who they are, and they are type A, but they're just quiet about it.
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of like I use the DISC personality test. It's what I got certified in. And that dominant personality, the D, they're usually the extroverts, right? They're usually the ones who they have the opinion and they want you to hear it.
Yeah.
And some of them are confident, but some of them aren't. Even though they're loud and proud, they're not always confident. They're just
Hmm.
they're just quick to make their decisions, and they want that work done. You give them a task, and they're going to give you a solution pretty quick. May not be right, but they're going to give you a solution quick, and they're going to tell you what they think about that. And if you take time, or if you appear more timid and you more calculated, they might even look at it as a sign of weakness. But you're right. I mean, there's strengths to all that. All the personalities uh, can absolutely get along if you're willing to understand that we just approach things a little differently in life. It doesn't mean that one way is better than the other. It just means that we're different.
What's your best advice on dealing with failure?
Don't be afraid to fail. And I know that's a hard thing to come to terms with, but fail forward. I think about all the great people who've done amazing things, who aren't afraid to fail. We hear all the entrepreneur stories, but I mean, I can't remember the quote, but like Michael Jordan, right? Michael Jordan
Oh
talks about
yeah.
how he lost 26 game winning buzzer shots,
Hmm.
or something like that, 26, 27, whatever it was. And he missed, probably thousands of shots in his life, but he says, I wouldn't be Michael Jordan had I not made those attempts, right? And I think, wow, that's powerful. And I think about my own life and the things that I was afraid to do. I mean, look at my from going from Joplin Police Department to the DEA. I mean, I was afraid to fail. I truly was. I was. All I kept on thinking was, I hope if things don't work out, Joplin lets me come back. I hope my job's still there and safe. Um, but I'm glad that I took that leap. Right. I'm glad I took that step forward, because it just opened up so much more in my life, and that was a wonderful thing. So, just don't be afraid. And I know that, again, I know we don't like the pain that's associated with it, and we want to avoid that at all costs. But think about all the joy that can be associated with it as well, and all the missed opportunities out there if we just don't take that step forward.
Yeah. The example that you used of Michael Jordan is a perfect one. I,
Yeah.
I grew up in the era of Michael Jordan, and I used to just be glued to my TV when he was playing. And I think it's a safe assumption that he's considered to be the best basketball player of all time. And I know there's some people argue, but that's for another episode. But the thing, I think people seem to forget that Michael Jordan, the best basketball player of all time, multiple championships, defensive titles, defense, like a steel trap, just the best at everything. That guy made mistakes. He missed shots. People got past him. He got dunked on. it happens to even the best. And sometimes all we focus on is, well, if I'm not that, then I'm a failure. And it's like that person is a failure as well. They just learned and kept getting better over time.
Absolutely. And there's so many I absolutely agree. And there's so many. I mean, look at Steve Jobs, from Apple. I mean, he was fired, right? And then
Yeah.
he came back to Apple later on and made him a household name, right? I mean, who doesn't, how many iPhones and look at Apple, I mean, and you just go back historically. I mean, there was another quote, Thomas Edison, the light bulb, right? He talks about he didn't fail with the light bulb. He just found several thousand ways that it wouldn't work, until he found the one that did work, right? And again, there's so many examples in history, and we just gotta sometimes you just gotta take that leap forward and realize and think about the success that's in front of us.
Well, and if you're failing, that means you haven't given up. You're still trying. So,
Yeah, that's true.
now if you keep failing, maybe you need to step back and take a look at what you're doing, but still. So, I like to talk about pay a little bit, and I'm
Sure.
not asking you what you make, but when someone works in the DEA, can you give me some rough numbers as far as when you start, you're going to be in this range, and then as you work your way up to, upper middle management, whatever most folks end up, then you
Yeah,
might end up here?
yeah. So that was a big reason why a lot of folks were going to federal law enforcement, because of the pay. I mean, it's substantially different from, when I left Joplin, I was making. I know it's a lot different now, but when I left Joplin in 1999, I was probably making 25, 26 a year.
Yeah.
And I know it's a lot different now, but this was, of course,
The
30
cost
years
of living
ago.
was a lot less too. Yeah.
It was. When you go to the DEA, you start as usually a GS9 on the pay scale. And then the one thing about federal law enforcement, like DEA, if you're a criminal investigator, if you're what they call an 1811, you make 25% more than what the pay scale shows.
Okay.
So what that is, it's called availability pay. So instead of overtime, it's built-in overtime. So you're expected to work 50 hours a week. If you work 51, then guess what? You're only getting paid what they pay you. If you work 100, and that's happened quite a bit, you're only getting paid what they pay you. So they give you this on the front end, and they assume that you're going to work on average about 50 hours a week. If you're a good criminal investigator, you're probably working a lot more than that. But so a GS9 in the government, the last time I looked was probably about 61,000, and then add
Yeah.
25% to that. So that's another 15,000 ish. So a brand new agent at the academy is going to be making about 75 or so, $1,000. Now that also depends on where he or she is stationed.
Okay.
So if you're assigned to, Springfield, Missouri is considered what we call rest of the U.S. There's no extra locality pay here because they found that the cost of living is cheaper here than, let's say, San Francisco or Washington, D.C.
Sure.
So if you're in an area like that, you are going to get a bump. Probably still not going to be able to live in a place like San Francisco, because who can?
Yeah, I know it.
But you might make $100,000 out of the academy going to a place like San Francisco because of the extra probably 25 or 30% bump in pay. And I know people are thinking, well, that's a lot of money. Yeah, it's a lot of money in Springfield, Missouri, but
Yeah.
in San Francisco, it's not a
No,
lot of money.
not at all.
When you're paying $1.5 million for a 1,300 square foot townhome that was built in 1790, and you got a 30-year mortgage,
Yeah.
your $100,000 is not going far. That's why so many people can't live in San Francisco, because it's
Yeah.
just unaffordable. But yeah, so back to your question, I would say about $75,000 on average,
Okay.
depending on where you live, and then you should expect it's called step increase. I'm sorry, a grade increase every year, at least for the first couple years. So you'll go from a 9 to an 11. If you're in the FBI, you'll go from a 9 to a 10, unless they've changed it. And then from an 11 to a 12. And then 13 is what we call journeyman. That's the highest level you can get in DEA before being a supervisor. So if you have a career agent who doesn't go into management and he's been there for more than, let's say, 5 or 6 years, then that person is a GS-13, and that's pretty good money. So you're talking about probably, I don't know, probably $100,000 to $110,000, and no supervisory responsibilities. No, you don't have anybody to take care of except for yourself. Um, so pretty good money, and pretty good, um, health and other,
Oh, a benefits package?
yeah, benefits is pretty good
Yeah.
as well. They're trying to chip away at that right now with our with our current Congress. So
Yeah.
that'll be interesting because that will absolutely impact recruitment for agencies like DEA, FBI, um, HSI, ATF, because when you can stay at your department and you have the safety, and you have your home, you have your friends, you have your the comfort level, and then I tell you, hey, come to the DEA, and they're like, well, how much? What's the difference? And well, you're going to get paid $2,000 more, but we're going to move you all across the country.
Oh, brother.
You may not be interested in that, right? Back when I left, I was, because I left. One is I wanted to do the job, and I would have done it for free. Don't tell them I said that, but I would have done it for free. But number two is ultimately, I mean, I got to pay my bills, right? And I went from a 26,000 year job to, I think at the time we were probably 40. But once you hit that GS-13 level, you're making good money, and
So I
and
would imagine that if someone wanted to really dive into, they can look up a GS pay scale, and then that would give them a rough idea. You probably could even Google the DEA pay scale, and you might find some more dialed in numbers depending on your grade.
yep, and then also those pay skills will break it down by locality. So if you
Oh,
know that you're going to get hired and you're going to go to St. Louis, you're going to go to Phoenix or Chicago, then you can actually look for those locations in there. And if you go to not a country, a state that doesn't have any of that, have its own locality, then you're what they call the rest of the U.S. Like Springfield, Missouri is rest of the U.S. Um, so yeah, they're all online. It's just add 25% to whatever you're looking at. Just look for a LEO pay scale, GS pay scale, law enforcement officer GS pay scale, and then add 25% to the grade. Not too bad.
do you have much say in where you want to go as far as, I'd like to be in this part of the country or that, or when you're early on, it's just kind of, yeah,
That's
you can tell us
interesting.
what
And
you
when I
think,
got
but
hired, when I got hired, the answer was no, absolutely no. They told you in the academy where you were going. Now they would give you a wish list. They would say, "Hey, give us 3 places that you'd like to go." And sometimes they would give you a list of, let's say there was 50 people in your academy class, and they would say, "Here's the 50 openings we have. Where would you like to go?" But they've changed that over the years. Now, in an attempt to better recruit people, because they were losing people. You and I would go to the academy, and then we'd find out we're moving to San Francisco, and we can't do that, right? It's just too
yeah.
expensive, and or we didn't want to do that. We would quit. So now what they're doing is they're telling people when they make that call, they'll say, "Hey Tim, we got a position in Phoenix. Are you interested?" And then you just say yes or no. And if you say yes, boom, you got an academy date. If you say no, then they have to decide what they're going to do. Are they gonna recycle you and wait and give you another opportunity to for a different city, or are they just going to look to the next person and move on? That's always
Hmm.
changing. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, they have needs, and depending on where the needs are at. It's sometimes like, look, I know you want to go to Hawaii, but we're chock full in Hawaii. So,
yeah,
you're going to Sheboygan, Wisconsin or something like that,
Sheboygan,
so
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, been there.
Yeah. So you've wound up your career in the DEA. As we land the plane here, talk to us about the Eagle 6 training that you have going now and you're doing after your time with the DEA. Walk us through that, where they can find you, what is it that you do, and all that good stuff.
So Eagle Six Training is my training and consulting business. We're on the internet at www.eagle6training.com, and the six is not the number. I'm sorry, the six is the number. It's not spelled out. So EAGLE 6TRAINING.com.
Okay.
And we offer training, consulting, and speaking services. A lot of our current clients are law enforcement, but we do have business clients as well, and we're not, you know, as you can see, most of the folks that I'm working with are prior law enforcement, prior DEA, but that's just where we came from. we have skills that translate into to all industries. And we do a lot of training and consulting with various people out there and various organizations out there, and happy to custom develop and deliver, whatever your training needs might be. The emphasis is typically on leadership. I've done some other stuff as well. We've been asked to do some like resilience and trauma type training. And I always bring that back to leadership. I think leadership is another way that we can help people and organizations be better. So my other endeavor is my nonprofit organization. That's Only2MG, www.only, and then again, just the number 2, it's not spelled out, and then mg.com. And that's the nonprofit. We were formed to address illicit fentanyl. Our entire board is retired DEA agents. But we've now since expanded to address emerging public health threats as well. So it goes beyond fentanyl. But yeah, that's me. That's what keeps me busy. Keeps me quite busy.
Yeah, sounds like it. Well, I got to tell you, Brian, I was looking forward to this interview. It's not every day that I get to talk with a DEA agent that's got so many years of experience and insight. So I do thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to be a guest on the show.
Oh, no, my pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity, and it was a good conversation. Thank you.
And that wraps up another episode of the Jobs Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. Hopefully you found that interesting. As always, I wait until the end of an interview to ask you to like, subscribe, and share. I feel it's important that I earn that support from you. Thanks again, and we will see you on the next one.